Hi, my name is Anjali Wolstencroft. My tutor's name is Elizabeth Bryan, and my tutorial is on Wednesdays at 2 p.m. Today, I'll be giving a presentation on the impact of some of my teaching during my professional experience and what I learned from it. So, firstly, I'll start by giving an overview of the school and classroom I was placed into. It was quite a small co-ed primary school with approximately 100 to 120 students in total between prep and year 6. I was placed into a year 1-2 composite classroom with 20 students in total, 4 from year 1 and the rest in year 2 with varying student profiles. The key learning intention that I chose to focus on came from the maths curriculum and is derived from the statistics and probability strand. On this slide, I've shown both content descriptors from the curriculum that I covered in the maths unit while I was on practice to give context, but the focus of this presentation, however, is the work that I did with the year 2s when we started to look at the language of chance, not only to describe everyday events, but also to describe the likelihood of drawing a marble out of a bag, so describing everyday chance events or chance experiments. I chose this partially because I think that I learned more from this experience and it was more significant, but also because the year 1s picked up their content fairly quickly. Because this learning followed on from us covering the same vocabulary, such as likely and unlikely for familiar everyday events, I did have some formative assessment work samples, including the table to the left here, where students could show their understanding of new terminology by writing and drawing examples of events they believed matched up. And then another activity that we had done was a sorting activity with these cards you can see photographed on the right. A lot of this showed that for the most part, students did understand the meaning of certain and impossible, while some occasionally struggled with the terms likely and unlikely and their reasoning. Being able to ask questions and make observations was great for assessing this, as I could ask for students to elaborate on their thinking verbally. Obviously, that was not enough. And it didn't examine the knowledge of classifying and describing outcomes of chance events and experiments, which was needed. So the curriculum hadn't touched on it in previous years, as I showed before, but I did need to know what my next steps would be, which meant giving a more formal diagnostic pre-test. When I started to look into the assessment strategies I'd use, I kept in mind the reading and writing levels of the students, which were quite low. These things were significant because of how much this content relies on them teaching and learning new content specific vocabulary and also worded questions. So this diagnostic sheet here was created by myself, but it drew from the adapted C2C assessment piece that students had to complete at the end of the unit. You'll notice that it doesn't actually include many sections for students to show their reasoning. Given the reading and writing levels and time constraints, it would have been ill-advised to include it when we would have to read it to them and scribe the answers. So the actual artifacts that I can present on this slide are a couple of student artifacts. So the one on the left, which is student 2, shows that they mostly understood the terms certain and impossible to describe the outcomes, and they were actually able to complete question 5 because of that. Their ability to use the terms likely and unlikely seemed to be lacking though. So the student on the right, however, performed really well, which meant that I could flag them for enrichment activities. The feedback that you see here is a reflection of my feedback strategy that I basically used throughout the whole teaching, learning and assessing cycle, which was to give feedback that I can give verbally, but it was in accordance with the notes that you see here. So students can actively immediately use it in their learning. So I would give it to them either at the end or the beginning of that lesson, usually the beginning, so that they could use it straight away and it would prompt their thinking. Here I just have a summary of what data was collected. The data showed that while over half of the students could use the term certain and impossible, a third of them could not really do the same, could do the same with the terms likely and unlikely, but the rest couldn't. What was interesting was that these two terms sometimes actually got mixed up, but more so that students also often gave the answer impossible when it should have been classified as unlikely, or the same for certain and likely. So this showed to me that the next step would be to focus on the meaning of these terms and how we can use reasoning to justify when we use them to describe an outcome. So the following learning experience moves on from that. As I said before, the diagnostic really failed to get an idea of the student reasoning and logic behind the answers. So the learning experience used an interactive whiteboard website. Before that, students watched a video that revised the terms that they needed to use. The Marble Jar interactive site was engaging. It was a whole class experience, and it allowed me to create a really wide range of scenarios and then question students on the answers that they gave. So due to this being widely driven by myself, though, the informal formative assessment for learning was just based on observation and names on sticky notes that I could jot down as well. During the activity, though, I gained some really useful insight into their reasoning. So what was apparent was that students needed more hands-on learning. They needed to be able to see that it was still possible, for example, to draw a red marble out of a jar when there's only one in a jar of 20 other marbles. I also found it interesting that students believed that marbles closer to the top of the jar were more likely to be picked, while a somewhat reasonable response. This showed the need to link our reasoning to the mathematical concept of how many of one color there is, and using terms such as more and less to describe that. I then thought to link that to the students being unable to differentiate between when to use the words likely and certain and unlikely and impossible, because I hadn't explicitly taught them to count each color, which would have been really helpful and I should have done from the start. So students also needed prompting to give reasoning for their answers, which showed the need to focus more on the word because to prompt that justification. I then followed the game with a worksheet where students read the questions and colored the marbles or chose a multiple choice answer. These work samples mostly confirmed my observations from before, but they were helpful because I could refer back to them to show which students in particular needed more help when I grouped them later for activities. It was clear that through this learning experience that students still needed help, but I now knew the specifics to focus on. So the following second learning experience was a 10 to 15 minute mini lesson that was basically a very similar activity, but this time I changed the success criteria while keeping obviously the same learning intention to hone in on using the words because and more or less when giving reasons for our response. I also introduced a probability line to the students, which is pictured on your right here, to have a visual backup for their understanding of these terms, which is also an age-appropriate pedagogy that I was able to employ. When I look at the formative assessment that I did there, I used colored dots as well for a short-term self-assessment where students could show how they felt with the lesson. I'd already noted on the right there or on the left of that graph how I felt that they were progressing, because it was all just anecdotal because it was explicit instruction almost. But it mostly matched up, which was a positive because it gave the impression that on the whole, my teaching and feedback in particular aligned with their performance, and they were aware of that feedback and the progress that they could make. So for the next lesson, I organized maths rotation activities where students engaged with the content in a variety of modes. And my aim here was to ensure that students had experience transferring their knowledge to different situations and had exposure to a wide range of examples of chance events and experiments. So this learning also aligned with the formative assessment conducted previously, where I identified that students would benefit from engaging with manipulatives to aid their understanding in a manner that was more rooted in kind of constructivist inquiry-based learning. So to track how these rotations worked, I took a few anecdotal notes and reflected on the following group discussions with teacher aides and my supervising teacher that took the other groups for that rotation, and then a couple of those rotation activities are just on the slide as well. For the formative assessment following that, I gave students another worksheet that was actually really similar to the original diagnostic. And then I added that data to the spreadsheet, and I was actually really pleased with the results. So prior to the learning intervention, students had misconceptions classifying an event as likely versus uncertain. And across these types of questions, which were numbers 3 and 4 that you'll see on this slide here, I saw an increase of correct answers of about 25%. So students were also answering an average of just over 4 questions correctly, which was compared to the just over 2, even taking into account the extra question on the second formative assessment, was still a really big improvement. So I also saw a reflection of these results in the summative assessment that the students did with me. So here you can see that student 2 in particular initially struggled with using the terms likely and unlikely following the first lesson. And I found they still needed a bit of work using the new terminology, but it really improved after particularly working on using language to, it particularly improved after working on using language to reason and being able to explore more chance events in the group work. And then when we look on to the improvements for future practice, what I really found was that using more quantitative diagnostic tools for the multi-choice questions, like clickers, which are a technology one, in conjunction with a tick and flick would have given me more timely data, and it would have made sure that no one went under the radar. The diagnostic just didn't assess reasoning, and I think that created a time constraint that wasn't necessary, so I could improve on that. The learning experiences were mostly whole class. I did let a couple of students continue to fly under the radar in a sense when you look at the data, even though I recognized that they were struggling with the concept. So when I consider it from like a TPAC approach, I could have worked on my pedagogical content knowledge. So I could have introduced the line of likelihood and other resources much more quickly. I could have had them doing group work much sooner. I could have incorporated technology into the group work itself. So given them a bit more agency, made it more engaging. And yeah, just giving them a bit more of an opportunity to explore different kinds of chance events and experiments. But overall, I was proud of it, and thank you for listening.